Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is God's Ape, Poetical Paradox, and Iain McGilchrist's Theory of the Brain. How often have you made your foolish japes, and said that love's servants, every one in foolishness, were all God's apes? Geoffrey Chaucer. Hi everyone, and this is the poem I'll explain the Chaucer in a second, but this is the poem I'm going to use at the end of the talk to illustrate Iain McGilchrist's theory of the brain. It's a satire against reason and mankind from 1674. And it's John Wilmot, the Earl of Rochester, who, to put it mildly, was a bit of a rogue. And I'm going to quote, so I want to give full credit. There'll be quite a few quotes from this paper by James E. Gill. Mind Against Itself, Theme and Structure, in Rochester's Satire Against Reason and Mankind. And the spelling is different. It's a more old-fashioned spelling in satire in the first poem title, and Gill has spelt it differently, so that's not a typo. So why I've chosen this poem, because I think it just illustrates in a very practical way some of the issues Iain McGilchrist talks about. And I came across the Chaucer at the beginning. I came across this phrase, God's ape, and it was the first reference I could find in literature. I think Chaucer wrote those words that I quoted in the 1380s, it's estimated. I can't, if anyone knows of an earlier reference, I think in 1930, Wyndham Lewis wrote a novel called God's Ape, or God's Apes, and it's been used historically to refer to the notion of Satan as God's ape. But this poem that we're going to look at in a while is the way in which, against reason and mankind, it's the way in which within mankind, within human beings, we have this antinomy, we have this contrast between the reasonable and the animal-like, and they're constantly in turmoil or balance depending upon the person in question. And 2 videos ago, I looked at the art of paradox, and we explored, so these are standalone videos, but the previous 2 videos complement this one. So in the art of paradox 2 videos ago, I looked at analytical philosophy and pure logic, and showed how they tried to deal with paradox by excising it, by getting rid of it. Then the previous video, The Dusk of Civilization, Civilization's Dusk, I referred to how Iain McGilchrist reckons that we're on the cusp of radical social change because we've let the left brain hemisphere we've left the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere has come to dominate our dealings and the ability of the right hemisphere to compensate and to provide balance. So just to recap, the left-hand side of our brain is more associated with cold, hard rationality, logic, short-termism, grasping things. And the right hemisphere of our brain, according to Iain McGilchrist, allows pattern recognition. It's more metaphor-based. It deals with the subtlety of language. So at the very beginning, I deliberately wanted to have the Chaucer quote alongside the original English Chaucer used to help you see, because I studied Chaucer for a little bit in high school and was fascinated by how you see the origins of your own language and how we have evolved from then, but some of the subtle nuances that have remained, some of the subtle nuances that have changed. And one aspect of losing familiarity with literature, which I would argue is an aspect of the loss of the right hemisphere's dominance in our society, or strength of the right hemisphere influence, is because we've lost touch with literacy. And it's increasingly rare that any high school kids would learn any Chaucer, and if they did, they'd most probably learn modern English translations rather than battling with the original and seeing how it's morphed into current contemporary English. So to dive straight in, so this is just a visual representation, obviously, of the left hemisphere and right hemisphere and Iain McGilchrist's central concept. But this is something he quotes that I mentioned in the previous video, but I'm going to keep coming back to. So this is what he says people said to him conversationally. He said there were people who were shocked and were just fascinated by this whole right hemisphere, left hemisphere division and how they need to work closely together, but how we've allowed the left hemisphere to dominate. So that's one group of people who'd never heard about this stuff and were fascinated by it. But the other main group of people Iain McGilchrist said, were these people who said, it's something I knew intuitively at some level what you were saying. I kind of knew this, but I had no way of putting it into words. And what you've helped me do is put it into words. And I'm taking that quote, which McGilchrist relates to the reader, even more literally by showing you how in the Earl of Rochester's poem he puts into words the sentiment behind this common quote that Iain McGilchrist received. The Earl of Rochester, John Wilmot's poem, puts into words this constant tension between the animalistic, the ape side of us, and the bestial. We'll talk about the satyr in a moment. So that side of us, and the more conceptual, rational, immaterial, the more soul-like, divine-like ability to reason. And how in humankind they're always in tension and sometimes greatly imbalanced. So I'm not downgrading what Iain McGilchrist has done at all. It's brilliant. But he's providing quite often, he goes into a lot of philosophy and he goes into a lot of scientific, neuroscientific proofs of what he's talking about. And he does relate to some art and literature. But I want to go into more depth, completely following Iain McGilchrist's model, but show you how a poem from 1674, this is how far advanced literature and art has always been in understanding. And I'm just picking a poem because it's particularly apposite from 1674. But we'll be looking at in future videos Shakespeare from, even earlier. And I will be doing, when I get the chance, a video on the Ovid's Metamorphosis in detail. So that's 2,000 years ago. And then even further ahead than that, I will be looking at some biblical writings, their literary qualities, and how the whole of Western civilization, Homer as well, we might get to look at. But in the whole of Western civilization, the balance or imbalance between reason and our animal instincts, it's common currency. It's always been dealt with. And it's only in our contemporary society that, as was pointed out in the previous video, that drawing upon McGilchrist, this concept of civilization's dusk, we're coming to the potential end. It sounds dramatic, but Iain McGilchrist, states it in an interview several times. He sees our current civilization becoming ruined by the dominance of left hemisphere-like thinking and the loss of literary thinking, the loss of artistic thinking that's much more a part of the right hemisphere's dominance. So what are the consequences? So to build upon the previous video and the idea that civilization's at its dusk, in contemporary times, I'm arguing because we've lost touch with literature and art, which are the two key themes, poetry, literature, visual art, drama, these are all aspects of what this channel's about. And without them, I think it causes a post-literate society. So we're now in a realm of post-literacy. And I'd suggest that the consequence of that are the following. You have identity confusion, because literature and art have always been a great resource for working out issues of identity, for thinking out loud and for thinking in very subtle ways. So I mentioned Ovid's Metamorphosis, but there is lots of stories within stories. It's like snakes devouring snakes, whereby people change their sexuality, people change their gender, all sorts goes on. And as the name metamorphosis suggests, metamorphoses, these constant changes. So this is what literature's been doing since time immemorial. And when you lose touch with that, you get this identity confusion. People are overemphasizing, they're overclaiming, they're over-investing in categories all the time, because the nuance and subtlety provided by literature and art is increasingly not available to them because they lack familiarity with it. And I'd link this to, it might sound a bit of a stretch, but emotional incontinence. Again, art provides catharsis. Aristotle wrote about this. The idea that, and we'll mention Nietzsche and the concept of the birth of tragedy. You know, the ancient Greeks had artistic forms, especially tragedy, that helped process emotion, that helped turn it into a sublime art form, so people wouldn't use TikTok and other contemporary social media forms to have emotional meltdowns. It's truly bizarre. The inability to control your emotions seems to be some type of weird social currency these days, which is linked to the concept of narcissistic self-obsession. So I understand totally why you might be now shouting at your screen to quoque if you're as pretentious as I am. But this idea that you also, I would defend myself. I'm not being narcissistic doing these videos because I'm invariably looking at other people's work. Yes, I'm giving my opinion, but I'm trying to throw as much literature and as many references at you as possible. Whereas, again, the dominant social currency within social media tends to be just weird personal, just accounts of personal feelings and emotions rather than actually reasoned conceptual thought that you can engage with in any shape or form. The assertion of your emotional state replaces actual discourse, which we can argue till the cows come home. Well, I think Iain McGilchrist approaches some of these issues because both Iain McGilchrist and another guy called Louis Sass, they have written about the way in which modern society increasingly exhibits schizoid autistic traits. So there's a spectrum of schizoid autism, and increasingly the values in our contemporary society are reflecting that spectrum and being reinforced by technological pressures. And all of this has been exacerbated by the active and passive, I'm calling it active and passive, but cancel culture, the way in which they're actively, when I say they, students who are triggered by past literature or art or historical figures that they think have done bad things are being cancelled and often backed up by universities or allowing students to do this. So that's the active, seeking to cancel things rather than seek to understand things within their original historical context. And in the previous video, I lent quite heavily on the interview Hannah Gall did with Iain McGilchrist, in which the title of the article was all about everything is context and nothing, is anything without a context. I think I'm paraphrasing, but that was the title of the article. And context is everything, and yet it's being cancelled from our culture. That's actively. The passive is when you don't actively have to go out and cancel anything. If people aren't reading great literature anymore, if people aren't engaging with great art, it just becomes a marginal pursuit of people like you and me on this channel. Well, you don't have to go out your way to stop it. It's just not happening anyway. And that's, I think, why Iain McGilchrist repeatedly refers to the notion that our society is on the verge of ruin in terms of cultural strength. So this is a picture by Peter Paul Rubens, and I'm trying to remember, it's roughly 1617. seems to be rattling around in my senile head. But this is called Two Satyrs. And in ancient Greece, the satyr, the idea was it was half man, half horse. The bottom half was the horse. And without being too crude to put you off your dinner or lunch or whatever, the figures were often horse bottom halves in a state of permanent arousal. I think there's a medical term, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, but satyriasis, which is basically would be the equivalent of someone taking far too much Viagra and the after effects, or just permanently being in that state, which I suppose is basically being a teenager. But this painting was called Two Satyrs, and I forgot to mention earlier on, forgive me, I need to give a shout out to my good friend Richard Grannon, who originally put me on to the Earl of Rochester's poem. And this doesn't look, if he had this guy had a shave and got rid of his horns, it's not a million miles from looking like a bit like Richard. But this is obviously a depiction, and there's quite a menacing look. And I think if we go on to, you almost saw another goat man. This is a great quote from Nietzsche's, I mentioned Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy. Nature, as yet unchanged by knowledge, with the bolts of culture still unbroken, is what the Greek saw in his satyr, who nevertheless was not a mere ape. The satyr was something sublime and divine. Here the true human being was disclosed. The bearded satyr jubilating to his god. Confronted with him, the man of culture shriveled into a mendacious caricature. So Nietzsche, it's a great, if you want to introduce yourself to Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy is a great place because it was one of his earliest works, but also it's just relatively accessible before he goes off into his the esoteric mysticism of Thus Spake Zarathustra and other works. But in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche just takes this idea that the ancient Greeks, in the art form of tragedy, and I will have to do a whole video because it's in and of itself it's quite complicated. But in a nutshell, tragedies involved the chorus. We understand differently. The Greek chorus would be a group of people dressed like satyrs, half men, half goats, and the idea was it morphed from half horse, half man, to increasingly being half man, half goat, so like the Pan. And they would give a running commentary on the play. So the play is tragic and conceptual, which Nietzsche refers to in terms of Apollo, the Apollonian. And an inherent part of Greek theatre was also this Dionysian, the god of wine. So here the satyr has grapes. So the idea that the animal and the rational were combined in the art form of tragedy, and the Greeks had a way of sublimating in a brilliant, clever way this constant tension in humanity between the bestial and the rational. And Nietzsche's personal view was that, we've completely lost touch with the Dionysian, which he contrasts, as you can see here, confronted with him, the man of culture shriveled into a mendacious caricature. So for Nietzsche, he strongly believed you need both. You need the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And that, I would suggest, is really in keeping with Iain McGilchrist's left brain, right brain hemisphere idea. There's so much, in Eastern philosophy, yin and yang. And here is a picture of the Earl of Rochester, John Wilmot, and the little monkey. You can see how they mirror each other in a way, because on the right-hand side, the bottom, you can see John Wilmot's holding papers, and you can see the monkey. There's a satire here in which the monkey's ripped pages out of a book and is offering it to him. But also the way, you know, in the monkey's hand in the book, it's almost like he's keeping his place. But there's obviously reference, you know, the parallel between the human, they're aping each other in the way they're dealing with the book or the written word. So this, I've called this the beast of reason, because, as I've said, in Western civilization, there's been this constant tension in its art and literature and philosophy between the idea that as human beings we contain the bestial and the semi-divine. So with the ancient Greeks, I've mentioned Dionysus versus Apollo, and there were bacchanalian rituals in ancient Greece where you were initiated into the mysteries. And I won't go into a lot of detail, again, for a future date, but there is a concept of initiation into mystery, oblivion, and rational knowledge in ancient Greece. They were all related to each other in much more subtle ways, whereas now, as Iain McGilchrist points out, in modern society, everything is supposed to be rational. Everything is supposed to be clinical and well-ordered in huge bureaucracies, for example. Whereas in ancient Greece, this relationship between the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the bacchanalian, the frenzy versus cold rationality, these things were kept in a much more organic tension. And then with the ancient Hebrews, you've got this idea of original sin. So the whole book of Genesis in the Old Testament. And you've also got, again, I'll hope to do a video on the relevance of the Old Testament in terms of literary value. But the Old Testament is a scripture to promote monotheism versus, remember when Moses comes down from the Mount Zion, the Israelites have started worshipping a golden calf. And that is historically would have been true, as I think it was the god Baal, Baal. And in the story of the Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, you could argue that the Old Testament was promoting, it was persuading people of the time to change their ways. And Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham, or Abraham being prepared to sacrifice him. Child sacrifice was a thing at that time. So in Hebrew it's called Akedah, the binding of Abraham to God. But in quite a dark way, you can read that whole story as part of a propaganda effort to get the early Israelites to stop the pagan ritual of human sacrifice. And in, you know, it's horrible to think of, but at the time child sacrifice was known. And the whole notion of original sin. So right at, you know, in the book of Genesis, right at the dawn of human civilization, according to the Old Testament, there was this falling from grace. There was this idea that we were sinful. We gave in to animal desire. You know, Eve listening to the serpent. So within the texts of the ancient Hebrews, these issues are all there. And then in the time of John Wilmot, this idea of, you have the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell, and then subsequently his protectorate, and Restoration England, the time of Charles II, and it's an endlessly fascinating period of time. And last time I looked, it's quite interesting that there were relatively few biographies of Cromwell, when he's a massively interesting figure. And I know for a fact there are some North Americans who watch this channel. And when you think that, you know, there was the Mayflower landed in America in 1620, the period we're talking about, the poem was 1674, but Cromwell's around, all this is happening in Britain, Charles I being killed, the Restoration of Charles II. All of this is the mid-1600s. So all of this is, these are the type of people, roughly, historically, who were going off to settle in America. So I would have thought that, there's an interest for North Americans to see part of the cultural heritage. I think in the very first welcome video I did on the channel, I quote Robert Conquest's a section from Reflections on a Ravaged Century, where he talks about the way in which culture grasps at us with 1,000 invisible fingers. And when I've lived in America in total for about 18 months, and I was always fascinated to see little bits of weird little cultural things that I could vaguely recognise. You can see the influence of British culture that's completely been transformed, but little hints here and there. And what's interesting is I've put here Puritanism versus licentiousness. And I'm going to show you the notion of licentiousness actually within Puritanism. But it is a fascinating aspect of America, for example, that Puritans settled there. But in England in the mid-1600s, what you're battling with, and I'll be showing you specific examples, are the way in which the Puritans, and as the name implies, they're obviously about the denial of animal instincts, about the self-control based upon strong theological beliefs. But at exactly the same time the Puritans were dominant in England, you had this, what Freud would call, the return of the repressed. You can't keep repressing things without them reappearing elsewhere. So I'll be talking in a second about the Ranters, they were known as, who were these subsets, weird, religious, nonconformists, who grew out of the puritanical atmosphere in England at the time. And then again in future, I'm going to look at Shakespeare's nihilism, because this idea of, from original sin, the idea that we started off in paradise and we ended up being sinful creatures, emphasis upon creatures. So we were close to God in the Garden of Eden, according to the Old Testament, and then we became sinful creatures. So original sin, for in Shakespeare, in various plays, he's fascinatingly nihilistic and arguably existential, well ahead of his time. And this links later to Kierkegaard and his concept of angst. Because for Kierkegaard, angst or existential dread is intrinsically linked to the freedom we have to commit sin. So he always links it back to original sin. It's because we're free and we have choices that actually we have existential dread. Whereas in the Garden of Eden, you're all frolicking around, not knowing that you're naked, not a care in the world. Existential dread is inevitably linked to freedom. So to get to the origin of some of these terms, so the name of the poem is obviously punning upon the close similarity between satire and satire. So satire from the Latin satura, meaning full, not the satire of the Greek chorus. So obviously Rochester is punning. He wants to use both meanings, but they are actually etymologically separate. And then I've mentioned, in Nietzsche talks about in The Birth of Tragedy, how in the Greek chorus, in Greek tragedy plays, the goat men were jumping up and down, fully erect. And then the actual name tragedy comes, the origins, the etymology is goat song. And I've talked about the Apollonian and the Dionysian. But the key thing about that is tragedy as aesthetically filtered pessimism. So to go back to, why are contemporary youngsters so miserable? Why are they so confused about their identity? Why are they, mental illness and diagnoses of mental illness have gone off the scale? the Greeks at least, and in lots of subsequent literary cultures, art forms like tragedy can be interpreted as a way of providing a filter for these really strong emotions. And that's what I was referring to earlier. When you lack these filters, you give yourself over to emotional incontinence, narcissism, all these contemporary phenomena that you can see around us. So some of the historical and religious background to all this. So these are the dates of John Wilmot, who I've been mentioning. And I recommend guardedly the second of these poems, Upon Nothing, relates to the idea of nihilism. And in the previous video, I talked about Shakespeare, King Lear, nothing will come of nothing. Well, Wilmot wrote this interesting poem, Upon Nothing, which again, it's well ahead. If you think of Sartre and the existentialists, this is dealing with the importance of nothing in the 1600s. It's brilliant stuff. And it's laugh out loud funny if your sense of humour is as warped as mine. But the imperfect enjoyment, I'd check these out, both of them online, but the imperfect enjoyment, I don't know how to put this without putting people off a meal, but it's it's a poem about a man's premature excitement, let's put it that way. So it's very funny and incredibly crude. And this is a guy, John Wilmot, who wrote a poem called Signor Dildo. So he was an absolute rake. And interestingly, he died, he converted on his deathbed, and it reminds me of the phrase, there are no atheists in foxholes. But he lived as a libertine. He lived in absolute depravity throughout the court of King Charles II. His poems are obscene. You will be clutching your pearls and you will be shocked at them if you read some of them. I guarantee it. But he found God on his deathbed, which is nice. So I've mentioned the Restoration. So after Cromwell was got rid of, and the puritanical protectorate, the idea of all that had been repressed came flooding back in the Restoration period of King Charles II's court. And if you get the chance, just do some reading on it. It was licentiousness squared. It was licentiousness and then some. And one of these aspects was, it's this interesting phrase, antinomianism. So I'm giving you the origins there, against, and nomos, the law. And what that was it was a group of, I'll explain who the Ranters were, for example, but there were various groups, and antinomianism refers to the idea they didn't follow biblical law. And they had some weird ideas that the only way to get rid of sin, rather than try and repress and to act virtuously, it was to act out and to engage in all the sins imaginable. And therefore you could control it and find your way to God that way, which is an interesting perspective to take. So the Ranters, brilliantly named group. So these were mainly individualists whose intense experience of guilt and breakthrough left them free to act as they felt, led by the divine spirit within them. Their rather unstable doctrines might include rejection of the Bible, heaven and hell, and even God. Their conduct was antinomian: profanity, drunkenness, adultery, and nudity. That's just 4 of them. Some were ecstatic, others depressed, sometimes suicidal, often blended or alternating, confounded into the abyss of eternities, non-entitized into the being of beings, my soul split and emptied into the fountain and ocean of divine fullness, sunk into the abyss of silence. So that last bit is this Joseph Salmon, one of these characters. And why I've quoted all this is to get you to think about the abyss of eternities, non-entitized into the being of beings, my soul split and emptied into the fountain and ocean of divine fullness, sunk into the abyss of silence. There's a lot of what I now would claim would be addressed as mental illness. These are often people having psychotic breakdowns because it was a very stressful time. And one of the pamphlets of the Ranters was named, it's a brilliant name, A Justification of the Mad Crew. And their beliefs, so they had to get back to the notion of Pan, the goat god, they believed that God was everywhere in everything. So pantheism, I've mentioned antinomianism, and their key tenets were sex, tobacco, drink, and anti-work. So to anyone watching that from Liverpool, it's not much has changed. And behind their teaching that none can be free from sin till in purity it be acted as no sin was often a desperate, unplanned response to pressures. The Puritan ethic probably intensified such cases, but folk close to similar psychotic breakdown can be found in any time or culture. So if you weren't aware of this period of history, some of the, things that were happening, I just do find it interesting that there are periods in time where emotional incontinence, as in our time, comes to the fore. When people have psychotic mental breakdowns almost in groups, they become socially represented. And I think it adds an interesting perspective onto some of the things we're experiencing today. So this notion of shattered psyches, and what it does, it makes people vulnerable to demonic gurus. So the way in which people are led into cults, the way in which people are vulnerable to manipulation, whether that's politically or by conformism within modern society, shattered psyches lead to the likelihood of following gurus of various forms. So this is more material on the Ranters. Ranterism was no simple self-affirmation and probed the guilt from which sexual freedom was a frantic escape. And Kopp's experience of being rotted, sunk and damned by his encounter with the naked God shattered his psyche. Kopp, who I'll explain in a second, was one of the Ranters. But this idea that he wrote these were his own words, rotted, sunk and damned, with his encounter with the naked God, in other words, encountering God directly. So this was his work. A fiery flying roll is what he wrote. And a guy called Lawrence Clarkson, also known as Claxton, wrote the Single Eye. And if you're interested, both of those pamphlets can be found, I've put there, xclassics.com. If you look them up, you can read the full tracks. And this is one of the quotes. Till acted that so-called sin, thou art not delivered from the power of sin, but ready upon all alarums to tremble and fear the reproach of thy body. So I think this is from the Single Eye, and what it's saying is that this is the idea that in order to escape sin, you actually have to embrace it, you have to act it out. But all of that, the idea at the top about sexual freedom and shattered psyches, you could argue it's almost what happened with the hippie revolution and then the hangover. You can have free love, but there's always a consequence afterwards. It's, to some extent, an attempted frantic escape from pressures that you don't want to deal with, but it's a short-term solution. And this was, I'm just giving you a 1650. This is one of the pamphlets relating to the Ranters. So I just thought you might like to see the original, but I've blown up the actual illustration. So if there's any anyone under a certain age, I'm warning you that I'm blowing up the detail. A bit of priapism is coming your way. But this was, I wasn't exaggerating that these were quite licentious people. And these are woodcuts depicting. And there is some debate amongst historians as to how widespread. So the Ranters and others definitely existed. The debate is to how widespread they were. But there were acts of parliament passed to ban books, and to pursue some of these characters. So it's sometimes difficult to disentangle, was it a bit of a moral social panic? So what was their influence exaggerated? But they definitely were an issue. Which leads us to Rochester's poem that I wanted to look at. And this is Gill from his article. If we are to see the poem as something greater than a mere succession of contradictions, which are effective chiefly in the reader's response to them as such, then we must be prepared to see the poem as dramatizing, in a complex way, the problems of self-reflection or reflexivity, in which criticism and diatribe are themselves treated critically as well as performed. And what I really wanted to emphasize here was, I sort of italicized it, the concept of dramatizing. So Iain McGilchrist is providing this model of left and right hemisphere brain function. And why I think the Rochester poem is so important is because it provides an actual dramatization of the scientific distinction that Iain McGilchrist is talking about. And like I said, Iain McGilchrist does provide. He talks about René Magritte's paintings, for example. He does provide examples of the left-right hemisphere division and how they can work, or they should work, in conjunction with each other. But why I think this particular poem by Rochester is so important is it actually acts out in a practical, I'd argue useful way, what this tension between the bestial and the rational is. So reflexivity, the underpinning of McGilchrist's whole theory, is that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are in constant interaction with each other. And we, as truly rational human beings, need to be constantly reflecting upon the relationship between the two hemispheres of our brain. But obviously, that's easier said than done, because that's like trying to jump over your own shadow. So the extent to which we can reflect reflect upon our own process of mental reflection. You see how paradoxically it immediately sounds? We need to reflect upon the act of reflection. It's wheels within wheels. But performing or dramatizing it in poetry is actually what I was referring to earlier about what the ancient Greeks did with the art of tragedy. So these are at least 7. Gill points out that in Rochester's poem. So now I'm quickly going to give you some of the complexity in the poem before let's going through it. But this is how the poem is so self-reflectively complicated, that the satirist in his opening lines seems to deny the possibility of his undertaking and thereby creates a problem of point of view in the poem. So that's first contradiction. That he builds a case against human reason via his human reason, that's a contradiction. That he achieves, after considerable argument, the spontaneous wisdom of the beasts. That he then apparently denies the relevance of that wisdom to human conduct. That the satirist seems to employ the term reason in several different senses. That he is thus the comic victim of his own diatribe, or the satiric victim of his own satire. Again, there's reflection upon reflection, the poet reflecting upon his own poetry. That he at last conditionally recants his original contentions and provisionally holds that man may differ from man more than man differs from the beasts. So there's a long list of contradictions. And this is how it's such a brilliantly nuanced, layered poem. And just a little bit more context before we get stuck in. This idea of the epistemological paradox. So theriophily it's a concept of, it's a paradoxical belief that animals are worth or are more important than humans. And it's a paradoxical belief because, as you'll see in the poem, in order to believe that, you have to reason as a human. And why I've put this here in McGilchrist's disembodied or embodied life, a really strong underpinning of McGilchrist's work is that human beings are embodied in the world. We are active biological creatures. And what happens when the left hemisphere is allowed to dominate is that abstract models of reality, so my constant bugbear, bureaucracy, excessively logical, cold reason, that dominates over reason and intuition and experience that takes into account the realities of the physical world we live in. But at least for all its innate paradoxical nature, theriophily, this idea of animals are better than humans, at least it's an overcompensation, but at least it's a awareness that there are qualities in animal life that as humans we shouldn't completely reject. But this epistemological paradox, it relates basically, and especially in this poem by Rochester, the idea that the human mind's propensity to involve itself in self-defeating hypothesis. And I'm guessing for people who suffer from anxiety, they have this in an extreme form. They're thinking about their thoughts in a never-ending. It's difficult to get out of the constant regression. So the human mind has this unique propensity to involve itself in self-defeating hypotheses. As far as we can tell, animals don't. My dogs do not stress me as particularly stressed out creatures. Whatever else they have going on in their lives, they don't think about thinking. They live constantly in the moment, mostly to annoy me. But it's total nowness, and human beings just aren't like that, which is our curse and our boon. This is what the poem is about. Again, very similar, but this is a beautiful book by Rosalie Coley, Paradoxica Epidemica. It's very difficult. I had to spend a fortune and get my own copy. But if you can get a copy from the library, it's about how in the Renaissance, paradox was a dominant cultural theme. It's a brilliant book. But the mind, by its own operation, attempts to say something about its own operation. This is the epistemological paradox, the paradox of knowledge. The minute we begin to talk about how we know things, we're having to think about how we're thinking. It's this incredibly regressive, self-reflective process, which I'm going to explore, as I said, with Ovid's Metamorphoses, because the whole structure of Ovid's poem is reflection upon reflection upon reflection. It's brilliantly done. And this is 2,000 years ago. Paradox may lead to a controlled acceptance of incongruities and may therefore link as well as separate its elements in a bond not easily dissolved. And why I'm quoting this is, I'm strongly arguing, is a potential antidote to all the things that young people especially are suffering from today. Their inability to feel comfortable in their own bodies. Literature and good art lead to a controlled acceptance of incongruities. Art and literature deal with paradox. So they help you become more comfortable with incongruities. I used the word catharsis before, but these are the practical elements of art. So logos prophorikos, or uttered reason, and logos endiathetos, or the reason inherent in nature. And I'll keep saying this until you're going to get really angry with me, but a future video, I want to look at the concept of logos. It's the Greek word, and it's very difficult to define because it has many, many layers to it. Reasoned discourse is one short definition. But the idea of logos, it's where we get the word logic. And originally, pre-Socratic philosophers like Parmenides and Heraclitus, they had this notion that there was an underlying order to the world of logos. And I think that's also what underpins a lot of Iain McGilchrist's work. And other very famous philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer. This idea, and it's Eastern philosophy particularly, has this idea that there's an energy underpinning the universe, where harmony exists. So the reason inherent in nature is this notion of logos and diathetos. But logos prophorikos is the uttered reason. They're two arguably separate things. And again, it's interesting that this distinction could well be relevant to the left hemisphere, right hemisphere division. You know, the brain is an innately divided and simultaneously conjoined organ. There are two separate sections that should work together. And the problem is when these two different types of logos get separated too much. So one is discursive reason, whereas the other is the reason of things implicit in them. And throughout McGilchrist's work, he emphasizes how the right hemisphere focuses upon what's implicit, and the left hemisphere, left to its own devices without being compensated for by the influence of the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere is really bad at dealing with implicit things. It's on its own, it's basically autistic. It needs everything to be explicit. It can't deal with implicitness. And again, just to keep emphasizing this, poetry, art, literature, drama, they are right hemisphere activities that foster a really sophisticated understanding of what's implicit rather than just what's explicit. So that the entire poem has been conducted as a series of hypotheses which from the outset emphasize its reflexivity. At several points, in fact, in his initial strange paradox, in his fit of reason against reason, in the imagery of ascending and falling, in the description of wit as victimizing both the wit and the enjoyer of wit, in the appearance of the adversary and his fits of wit against wit and of reason for reason, in the satirist's all but useless writing of reason, in his forthright strictures on human duplicity, and his honest discounting of honesty, and finally, in his apparent willingness to give up much of his case under certain conditions, one can see the possibility that Rochester not only has his satirist enumerate traditional paradoxes, but also dramatizes them through the speaker's paradoxical train of thought. He does so by showing how in him the mind turns against itself. In other words, the speaker performs as well as remains aware of his own paradoxical thought. So apologies, it's a long quote, but it just shows you how layers within layers within layers, and again, this reminds me of Ovid. He's talking about the Earl of Rochester's poem, but all complicated poems or literature have these qualities. Now, in Rochester's poem that you're shortly going to read, all of this is going on at complex levels. But why that makes it such a valuable poem is it's a replication, it's an artistic representation of how the tortured human mind works. And the fact, when I say tortured human mind, that's obviously, I'm adding a normative element there almost to suggest, the human mind is somehow at fault. this, I think why the poem's brilliant is it actually helps you understand or appreciate that being slightly in conflict with itself is the natural state of being human. And I find that consoling. Rather than beating yourself up with anxiety, reading stuff like this should actually help you come to terms with it. So the conclusion of this is that mankind is a hybrid monstrosity. It lacks spiritual freedom or bestial certainty. So we've left the Garden of Eden, if you want to think of the Bible in literary terms. So we're not pure spirit, and we don't have bestial certainty for all the reasons just given, because the human brain is constantly self-reflecting. It's difficult for humans to live, or if not impossible, to live completely in the moment. So there is a fatal gap between thought and action in man, which is revealed by the gap that men must argue extensively to discover what beasts, without argument, know immediately. So this is the paradox of theriophily, the idea that animals are more important or more valuable than humans. In order for us to value what animals are like, we have to reason through that. So if I wanted to imitate my dogs, I'd have to actually go through a rational process to coin a phrase from earlier, to ape what my dogs are doing. And therefore, by definition, I couldn't be acting spontaneously. I couldn't be acting like my dogs. So we're unable to do what dogs can do. That's both our strength and weakness. But hey, that's what it is to be human. The point is, deal with it. So again, this is about Rochester's poem. The poem is the well-constructed expression and dramatization of the fundamental perplexities of a mind aware that mind itself is the source of all perplexity and all imagined virtue and all real vice. So this makes me think of, this is almost like postmodern before its time. The Earl of Rochester's poem is basically describing how virtue and vice only exist in the human mind. This idea that there are absolute truths or absolute values. Don't shoot the messenger. Rochester is suggesting these are all just figments of the human imagination. Not to say they're not important, but it's a very avant-garde poem from that philosophical point of view. So the self-evident gap between thought and action, between means and end, is not eliminated by the writing of reason, because the necessity of writing reason is the surest sign of the gap. If therefore man may achieve with labour the wisdom of animals, that very achievement precludes the practice of such wisdom. For in contrast to bestial directness, concreteness, and unanimity, his typical ways of thinking are characterized by struggle, indirectness, abstraction, and duality. The satirist must both set up a norm for reasonable behaviour and then imply that men cannot attain it. We see the reflexivity of man in the paradox that he simultaneously asserts, denies, and exemplifies or enacts the capacities and incapacities of human reason. So we are, trust me, about to go to the actual poem itself, you'll be glad to know, but this is important, so forgive me. All of this could be viewed, if you think back to the Paradox of Art video, and when I'm looking at the work of Willard Quine and pure logic, and I've mentioned earlier the idea that pure logic can try and excise, remove, get rid of all the ambiguity of human thought. This poem, by absolute contrast, is a dramatic representation of how such a logical world is largely and predominantly inhuman. You cannot separate out the paradox of the way the human mind works from the experience of being human. And if you do, like Willard Quine, then you're going against what I've described as the underpinning of Iain McGilchrist's whole philosophy, that we are embodied creatures in a physical world that combines our ability to reflect and our ability to experience. And it's not human to experience pure logic. That's not how we live as embodied creatures. I use the word creatures advisedly because, again, that's what the whole poem is about. So these are terms in the poem, so just as we come across them. So prodigious is used to mean monstrous. Bubbles are dupes or marks, as in someone being scammed. The formal band refers to the priest's collar. So at one point, there's an interlocutor in the poem. There's someone who argues with the narrator, and that's a priest. Sot, idiot, coxcombs, conceited fools. Ignis fatuus is a will-o'-the-wisp. It's like a gassy light on bogland or marshland. So you get led astray by a deceptive light. So Ingelo, Patrick and Cibber are all religious authors. His tub, Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes was a famous Greek philosopher who, legend has it, lived in a barrel, basically. And there's a few famous paintings. The legend has it that Alexander the Great at the time, the most important man in the world, says to Diogenes, "What can I do for you?" And Diogenes is sat down in his tub, and Alexander stood imperiously over him. And Diogenes famously said, "You can get out of my sunshine," meaning you're standing in the way of the sun. I was enjoying the sun before you arrived. So no respect for the most powerful man in the world. But sweating tub has the connotation of a cure for the pox, so that has an added layer. And then finally, Thomas Meres was a politician. So, having said all of that, I'm hoping it will help you have another element of appreciation for the poem. So I'll just read out the whole poem and then finish with the image you've seen of the Peter Paul Rubens painting, and hope you enjoy it. Were I, who to my cost already am, one of those strange prodigious creatures, man, a spirit free to choose for my own share what case of flesh and blood I please to wear, I'd be a dog, a monkey, or a bear, or anything but that vain animal who is so proud of being rational. The senses are too gross, and he'll contrive a sixth to contradict the other five, and before certain instinct will prefer reason, which 50 times for one does err. Reason, an ignis fatuus in the mind, which leaving light of nature sense behind, pathless and dangerous wandering ways it takes, through errors, fenny bogs and thorny brakes, whilst the misguided follower climbs with pain mountains of whimsies heaped in his own brain, stumbling from thought to thought, falls headlong down into doubt's boundless sea, where, like to drown, books bear him up a while and make him try to swim with bladders of philosophy. In hope still o'ertaken the escaping light, the vapour dances in his dazzling sight, till spent it leaves him to eternal night. Then old age and experience, hand in hand, lead him to death and make him understand, after a search so painful and so long, that all his life he has been in the wrong. Huddled in dirt the reasoning engine lies, who was so proud, so witty, and so wise. Pride drew him in, as cheats their bubbles catch, and made him venture to be made a wretch. His wisdom did his happiness destroy, aiming to know that world he should enjoy. and wit was his vain, frivolous pretence of pleasing others at his own expense. For wits are treated just like common whores. First they're enjoyed, and then kicked out of doors. The pleasure past, a threatening doubt that remains, that frights the enjoyer with succeeding pains. Women and men of wit are dangerous tools, and ever fatal to admiring fools. Pleasure allures, and when the fops escape, 'tis not that they're beloved, but fortunate, and therefore what they fear at heart they hate. But now methinks some formal band and beard takes me to task. Come on, sir, I'm prepared. Then by your favour, anything that's writ against this jibing, jiggling knack called wit likes me abundantly, but you take care upon this point not to be too severe. Perhaps my muse were fitter for this part, for I profess I can be very smart on wit which I abhor with all my heart. I long to lash it in some sharp essay, but your grand indiscretion bids me stay and turns my tide of ink another way. What rage ferments in your degenerate mind to make you rail at reason and mankind? Blessed, glorious man, to whom alone kind heaven an everlasting soul is freely given, whom his great Maker took such care to make, that from himself he did the image take, and this fair frame in shining reason dressed, to dignify his nature above beast. Reason, by whose aspiring influence we take a flight beyond material sense, dive into mysteries, then soaring pierce the flaming limits of the universe. Search heaven and hell, find out what acted there, and give the world true grounds of hope and fear. Hold, mighty man, I cry, all this we know from the pathetic pen of Ingelow, from Patrick's Pilgrim, Sibbs's soliloquies, and 'tis this very reason I despise this supernatural gift that makes a mite think he's the image of the infinite. Comparing his short life, void of all rest, to the eternal and the ever blessed, this busy, puzzling stirrer up of doubt that frames deep mysteries, then finds them out, filling with frantic crowds of thinking fools those reverend bedlams, colleges and schools, born on whose wings each heavy sot can pierce the limits of the boundless universe. So charming ointments make an old witch fly, and bear a crippled carcass through the sky. 'Tis this exalted power whose business lies in nonsense and impossibilities. This made a whimsical philosopher before the spacious world his tub prefer, and we have modern cloistered coxcombs who retire to think because they have naught to do. But thoughts are given for action's government, where action ceases, thoughts impertinent. Our sphere of action is life's happiness, and he who thinks beyond thinks like an ass. Thus, whilst against false reasoning I inveigh, I own right reason, which I would obey, that reason that distinguishes by sense and gives us rules of good and ill from thence. The bound desires with reforming will to keep 'em more in vigour, not to kill. Your reason hinders, mine helps to enjoy. Renewing appetites, yours would destroy. My reason is my friend, yours is a cheat. Hunger calls out, my reason bids me eat. Perversely, yours your appetite does mock. This asks for food, that answers, what's o'clock? This plain distinction, sir, your doubt secures. 'Tis not true reason I despise, but yours. Thus I think reason righted, but for man I'll ne'er recant, defend him if you can. For all his pride and his philosophy, 'tis evident beasts are, in their degree, as wise at least and better far than he. Those creatures are the wisest who attain, by surest means, the ends at which they aim. If therefore Jowler finds and kills his hers, better than Meres supplies committee chairs. Though one's a statesman, though the other but a hound, Jowler in justice would be wiser found. You see how far man's wisdom here extends. Look next if human nature makes amends, whose principles most generous are and just, and to whose morals you would sooner trust. Bejudge yourself, I'll bring it to the test. Which is the basest creature, man or beast? Birds feed on birds, beasts on each other prey, but savage man alone does man betray. Pressed by necessity, they kill for food. Man undoes man to do himself no good. With teeth and claws by nature armed they hunt, nature's allowance to supply their want. But man with smiles embraces friendship's praise, inhumanely his fellow's life betrays. With voluntary pains works his distress, not through necessity but wantonness. For hunger or for love they fight and tear, whilst wretched man is still in arms for fear. For fear he arms and is of arms afraid, by fear to fear successfully betrayed. Base fear, the source whence his best passion came, his boasted honour and his dear bought fame. That lust of power to which he's such a slave, and for the which alone he dares be brave, to which his various projects are designed, which makes him generous, affable and kind. For which he takes such pains to be thought wise, and screws his actions in a forced disguise, leading a tedious life in misery under laborious mean hypocrisy. Look to the bottom of his vast design, wherein man's wisdom, power and glory join. The good he acts, the ill he does endure. 'Tis all from fear, to make himself secure. Merely for safety, after fame we thirst, for all men would be cowards if they durst. And honesty's against all common sense. Men must be knaves, 'tis in their own defence. Mankind's dishonest. If you think it fair amongst known cheats to play upon the square, you'll be undone. Nor can weak truth your reputation save. The knaves will all agree to call you knave. Wrong shall he live, insulted o'er, oppressed. Who dares be less a villain than the rest? Thus, sir, you see what human nature craves. Most men are cowards, all men should be knaves. The difference lies, as far as I can see, not in the thing itself, but the degree. And all the subject matter of debate is only who's a knave of the first rate. All this with indignation have I hurled at the pretending part of the proud world, who, swollen with selfish vanity, devise false freedoms, holy cheats, and formal lies over their fellow slaves to tyrannize. But if in court so just a man there be, in court a just man, yet unknown to me, who does this his needful flattery direct, not to oppress and ruin, but protect, since flattery, which way soever laid, is still a tax on that unhappy trade. If so upright a statesman you can find, whose passions bend to his unbiased mind, who does his arts and policies apply to raise his country, not his family, nor, whilst his pride owned avarice withstands, receives close bribes through friends' corrupted hands. Is there a churchman who on God relies, whose life his faith and doctrine justifies? Not one blown up with vain prelatic pride, who for a proof of sins does man deride, whose envious heart makes preaching a pretence, with his obstreperous, saucy eloquence, to chide at kings and rail at men of sense. None of that sensual tribe whose talents lie in avarice, pride, sloth and gluttony, who hunt good livings but abhor good lives, whose lust exalted to that height arrives, they act adultery with their own wives, and ere a score of years completed be, can from the lofty pulpit proudly see half a large parish their own progeny, nor doting bishop who would be adored for domineering at the council board, a greater fop in business at fourscore, fonder of serious toys, affected more than the gay glittering fool at 20 proves, with all his noise, his tawdry clothes and loves. But a meek, humble man of honest sense, who, preaching peace, does practice continence, whose pious life a proof he does believe, mysterious truths which no man can conceive. If upon earth there dwell such godlike men, I'll here recant my paradox to them, adore those shrines of virtue, homage pay, and with the rabble world their laws obey. If such there be, yet grant me this at least, man differs more from man than man from beast.